I'm Allison Rogers, everyone. I'm the editor here at Collision Repair Magazine. I conduct these webinars every month, so I'm sure you've seen me before. So let's pass it over to our guests instead. Like I said, today we're talking about EVs and the EV effect on the vehicle ecosystem with Impact Auto Auctions. We've got David Rymarz and Blair Earl here today. So without further ado, I know everyone on the call probably has some sort of grip on what IAA does for the automotive industry, but Blair, could you give us a little bit of a background on what IAA does for the industry?
Thanks, Allison, and good to see so many of our friends joining today. Yes, IAA and Impact Auto Auctions provide a coast-to-coast and a total beginning-to-end solution in total loss management for the country. And we've combined that with our traditional model and a big pivot this year and successfully to our digital auction platform. So good to be on again today. And IAA is the parent company of Impact and is the exact same business in the United States and globally as Impact and continuing on with that strong brand presence across the country. So with no further ado, I wanted to thank David for joining and bringing his expertise today on the behalf of Impact and IAA. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Blair, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here and share some of the content we're working on. I'm from Chicago, so we tried to make sure everything in this presentation was relevant to the Canadian market, but there might still be a couple of U.S. data points. So, Blair and Allison will jump in at various points to kind of add a little bit more context and keep me honest. Little background, so data analytics and corporate strategy. Data analytics is really the predictive models that IAA is building. We have a computer vision model that automatically assesses damage severity of a vehicle in our ecosystem. Predictive pricing model, supply and demand recommendation optimization models. And then the corporate strategy piece, EV is a great example. That's why I'm here speaking today. It's how is the market developing? What are the trends? Where are the opportunities? And what are we going to go do about it? A little background, before I came to IAA, I was at CAR, the parent company of both IAA and ADESA. I was Vice President of Data Insights. And before that, I was part of the leadership team at Driven. It was an incubated company here in Chicago, big data play on predictive supply and demand optimization models in the used car space. That company was bought by CAR after 2 years.
Awesome. Yeah. So you've got a great grip on the operations of the automotive industry, and we're glad to have you here today. So I echo Blair's comments. Thanks for joining us from the States. So David, what are we going to be talking about today? I'll kind of pass the mic over to you and check in, but let's go over the agenda.
Yeah. So we got about 30 minutes of content today. I know we have a little longer blocked, so we wanted to make this kind of interactive. Hopefully there's questions that come in throughout. We'll also pause at the end to answer those that anyone might have. Really 5 areas we want to talk about. Really what's driving the EV demand from the consumer side. What is the state of the manufacturing ecosystem? How are these cars trending on the road and where do we think they're going to go? What's happening in the repairability life cycle for insurance companies? And then what are we seeing at the end of life or inside of our auction environment? So hopefully the last 2 sections can provide some new data and proprietary data that others haven't seen before.
So just David, I wanted to let you know, we just got a comment from someone just asking if you could speak a little bit louder. I think the mic maybe, if we get a little bit closer.
Yeah, I'll get a little closer.
Thank you everyone for dealing with our technical difficulties today. Back to the show. So yeah, lots of different facets to the automotive shift to electric vehicles. And obviously in Canada, we've got some pretty hefty goals. I know you guys do in the States down there as well. So yeah, let's get into it. Goodness, the slides are not cooperating. There we go.
No, it's working on my side. Okay, so just a summary in case someone has to drop early. The starting point is these are great vehicles, and it's really the great vehicles and the government subsidies that are driving demand. Tesla is certainly the market leader in Canada and the United States, but consumer choice is really expanding rapidly. Last I saw, I think 71 models are expected to come to market over the next 3 years. Those are new models. EV sales as a percentage of new cars sold is increasing, so it's up to 3%. It's a little higher than in the United States, but this is going to change slowly. And really, this is a function of the large car park that needs to turn over And so, that's really a message that we're trying to share, that like this isn't going to happen tomorrow. This is going to be a long change that we'll have time to adapt to. Two kind of points that are really driving maybe our ecosystem is EV repairs are very complex and costly. A lot of these vehicles have, ADAS, the advanced driver systems. And so those calibrations, those scans, those sensors, that's increasing the cost. That's a tailwind for total loss frequency. And then our buyers in the IAA ecosystem are really driving up EV prices. So as you think about it from an insurer's perspective, high estimated cost of repair plus a high salvage value, that's also going to be a tailwind for total loss frequency. And I just saw a report on Monday from North Coast Research. They're out of in the United States, but they were projecting up to a 30 to 40% total loss rate for EVs. And we'll talk about some of the drivers of why that might come to be.
Yeah, so 40%, that's quite significant. I mean, we're already seeing a lot of total losses today with exactly what you're talking about, the technology in vehicles. So I'm interested to learn more about that aspect. So obviously we want to know how many people are actually buying EVs?
Yeah, so this is a survey that we found in the United States. We liked it, because it really indicates that it's not just one factor that's driving this consumer demand. Certainly consumers think that the EV is better for the environment, and it is. Far less CO2 emissions. People think that it's the way of the future. The economics are really quite advantageous when you think about like fuel costs, certainly in this environment, also maintenance costs. And if you look on this kind of vertical chart here, financial and government incentives are pretty far down the list. Now, part of that might be because Tesla in the United States is no longer eligible for the $7,500 federal government. They've sold more than 200,000 cars. That was originally a program that came in 2008. If you also look at Hertz, they just announced a big 100,000 vehicle Tesla order. And you have to think those are very sophisticated buyers running very sophisticated financial models. That Tesla has to make a lot of sense in their ecosystem across many factors.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting that you note the incentives there. I mean, obviously, like you said, this is US data, but I think a lot of the misconception clearly, people think that the number one reason people are buying EVs is to get that check from the government.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're great cars, the really high safety standards, great acceleration. So it's people enjoy driving these vehicles. The other side of it is mandates, and that's kind of like the furthest extension of the incentives. These are more forward-looking, but you are seeing some, kind of municipalities, some countries put out like really ambitious targets for when to kind of transition to 50%, 100% EV sales or ZEV sales. And this is because the emissions, any way you slice it, is kind of up to kind of a third of what a gasoline-powered car would emit. And now just note here, these are really complex analyses. You got to think about, what are the CO2 emissions for mining the raw materials for the battery, kind of trace that back through the supply chain, think about how the energy is being produced in the grid. So some of these analyses look at, grid related emissions from like a total kind of emission perspective. But every analysis that I've seen, shows just this kind of correlation. It's just a massive reduction in total CO2.
Oh my goodness. There we go.
So this might be new news for a lot of people on the phone. I don't know if you've seen this, but we have a government organization here called the NTSB. They published a very in-depth safety assessment on electric vehicle accidents. This was in the January 2020 bulletin. If you look online, the link is below, but it's 2001. Over 80 pages. They really did a detailed assessment of 4 accidents that had high intensity fires at the scene of the accident, and then a number of accidents or a number of vehicles that reignited. So their findings were, just a summary here, that thermal runaway and reignition reignition after suppression are safety risks for these vehicles. Insurance auto auctions, we're processing a lot of cars in the Northeast from the Ida flood damage. and we had a Tesla that had a battery fire. So the flood kind of damage profile with an electric vehicle and stranded energy is an interesting kind of additional factor here. The energy remaining in a damaged EV poses a risk for shock and then also thermal runaway. So we do have differentiated safety protocols for handling these cars, shock gloves at check-in, more distance around the vehicle in our yards. And what the NTSB said is existing standards do not address these high-speed, high-severity accidents. You can look online and also see that a lot more water is required to put out one of these fires. So this was something that was a bulletin to these first responders. And we would expect kind of more government involvement here to kind of make recommendations on what to do in the future, especially as EVs grow as a percentage of total vehicles. The other interesting point not on this page was the Chevy Bolt recall, and this just got expanded in August in the United States. I think it's also applicable in Canada, but this is the first time we've heard of a recall asking for a vehicle not to be parked indoors and away from other property. And it was also recommended not to charge the vehicle unattended overnight. So, how this develops, could potentially be a bit of a headwind for overall EV sales. This is very much emerging and something everyone's tracking closely.
Yeah, you're right. The recall for the Chevy Bolts was also expanded into Canada. Same thing, can't park them near other vehicles, near property. No charging. I think there was about 200 plus vehicles affected in Canada. So, I mean, clearly as other automakers adapt to introducing vehicles like this, we could, I don't want to jinx it, but we could potentially see more challenges like this. Also, on the note of your first responders, I was recently at David Gould, I know he's on the call, at Standard Auto Records. They hosted a firefighter dismantling competition where they were dismantling these post collisions that they were basically training for. It wasn't electric vehicles per se, but I was speaking to a firefighter there and asked him about these training initiatives. And he said they, for a while, had fallen off, just in particularly their department, but they're kind of amping them back up now just because of how modern today's vehicles are, and realizing that a lot of the time they might walk into a situation and not entirely know what to do. It might not be following protocol they learned in previous years. So it's very interesting to know that. I mean, it goes more than just the automotive industry. First responders have to know this stuff too.
Yeah, and every model has different locations for where these high voltage cables are. They have different architectures for the high voltage lines are routed, so different pillars can or cannot be cut. Yeah, this is an area that's, again, very much emerging and likely will have implications on the insurance side. So what we were just kind of looking at is, what are the top models that are being sold? And in Canada, they use a phrase that I hadn't seen before. It's ZEV. So they kind of pull in both the battery electric vehicles, BEV, and into plug-in hybrids like the Prius Prime. And if you kind of look at this market, in the United States, Tesla has about 80% market share and slightly less in Canada. And there's over 25 models that are currently sold. And there's a lot of projections that as these new models come out, Tesla's market share should flatten. I would note that the same projections were given in 2019 and 2020. So I do think it is an interesting kind of point that Tesla has maintained the share kind of during this phase, even more so in the United States when they had their $7,500 kind of tax credit expire.
So just running a poll right now, asking the audience if any of them have ever considered purchasing an EV. About 70% have said yes. So indications are all there. It's clear.
Yeah, I did see in one of the presentations, 2 weeks ago that there was a Canadian survey with 60% of respondents, strongly evaluating an EV for their next purchase. So again, strong, very strong consumer demand. So it's really hard to overstate how different an EV is. 40% of the value of the car is tied up in the battery, 25% of the weight. The weight is substantial. So in our industry, weight really correlates to accident intensity. So that's something we are tracking very closely. For example, the new F-150 Lightning is 725 kilograms heavier than the comparable vehicle and the comparable F-150. You know, there's obvious implications here to recycling. You know, maybe not right now because the total car park for EVs is still quite small. But as you think about like 2025, 2026, you know, recycling of these massive batteries is going to be critical to maintaining that supply chain. And, you know, if you think about all of the forecasts that are kind of out there, they're so correlated with battery cost reduction curves. And a lot of that is around, will the battery raw inputs become constrained or not? How quickly can the recycling network become up or not? So a lot of this is kind of circular. And certainly, if you think about the sustainability, recycling is going to be a major component here.
Absolutely. And I know the Recyclers of Canada are eagerly working on figuring this out and getting everyone on board. So
yeah, I think in some respects, even a little further than the United States' network, more advanced. So this is just kind of a quick kind of time series plot, and it just shows how big the market is really becoming for lithium, cobalt, and nickel. As I've talked about it before, you know, a lot of these projections are based on the battery cost curves really coming down, but that, you know, kind of has an assumption that the raw materials, you know, are not going to become constrained. And so how the new and the recycled, you know, kind of material comes together to kind of maintain that cost reduction curve is going to be critical for meeting these really ambitious new sales targets. The other thing that is really an unknown right now is the battery chemistry. You know, a lot of manufacturers are trying to kind of pioneer a cobalt-less battery, for example. Cobalt has a very concentrated supply, and that would be a huge win for kind of further reducing the overall cost of an EV. So if you think kind of about like where the market is right now, you know, almost 30,000 BEVs sold through Q1 and Q2 in Canada. You know, it's projecting about a 50% year-over-year growth rate. That's now 3.3% of total vehicles sold. And if you expand it to include the plug-in hybrids, it's almost 5%. You know, just based on some rough estimates, that's probably still less than 1% of the 30 million vehicle car park. And I think there's really two main points here. One, Canada's probably you know, kind of growing at twice the rate as the United States. But then, you know, similar to the United States, it's still a very low base. You know, 1% of the 30 million cars. In the US, it's less than that, about 280 million cars. And so that is where we're kind of talking about this slow change. You know, so big year-over-year percentage growth, but still kind of a quite a low base in absolute sense. And that's why we're really seeing inflection points start to kind of like look more probable in that like 2025, 2026 time period.
Mm-hmm. And the Canadian government right now, they announced, I believe it was earlier this year, maybe 2020, the years just all melt together at this point, but they announced they wanted to end the sale of gas-powered passenger vehicles post-2030. So there's a lot of speculation as to whether or not they're actually going to get to that point with the state that we're at right now, but they're really pushing for it, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, that's new data because I had a different bullet point on one of the following pages, so you correct me. So I think, you know, this is a very similar kind of outlook as in the United States. Like this is quite a regional kind of population of vehicles. British Columbia is approaching 10% of total vehicles sold. That's on par with, you know, some of the European markets. In the United States, California is really the leader, and they're kind of driving the adoption curve. And part of that is kind of local state incentives, and then obviously further EPA fuel standards in the state. I know, Allison, you had a bit more of a background here on some of the kind of like local incentives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we know British Columbia and Quebec both have the provincial EV incentives. Ontario formerly had one, but we no longer have an incentive. We still have the federal incentive. If you're federally buying an electric vehicle, you can get money from the federal government. But on top of that, obviously, British Columbia and Quebec have those provincial incentives that drive people to get the vehicles. But as David was saying previously, the survey that we saw earlier indicates that perhaps that isn't really the case. Maybe it is just a mindset. there. We know British Columbia and Quebec are both ahead in renewable energy. British Columbia's got hydrogen vehicles as well, lots of charging stations. Quebec's got companies galore breaking ground on batteries and research. And then I know Dalhousie University in the Maritimes is also exploring a lot of battery initiatives. One of their scientists was working with Tesla briefly a few years ago. So there's a lot of battery knowledge circulating around these parts of Canada, but I know personally I've spoken to repairers and drivers from Saskatchewan, Alberta, the more rural areas, and they have concerns about negative 40-degree temperatures, driving 200 kilometers at a time, and perhaps not seeing an EV charging station. So there's really a wide breadth of mindsets. David and I were kind of talking about in our previous conversations here. Blair obviously provided some insight as well, but it feels like it is British Columbia and Quebec leading the way here in Canada. And yeah, that's what I have to say.
Great, thanks.
No problem. But yeah, Manitoba at the bottom there too. I have not actually heard a lot about Manitoba electric vehicle incentives. So if anyone on the line has any sort of lead there, I'd love to talk to someone from there about their mindset.
So if you kind of step back a little bit, you look at, maybe BCG's big white paper they just published. They think globally, the true battery electric car could reach, kind of 30% of new car sales by 2030. Europe is starting to kind of go up that S curve, and the S curve, as you mentioned, Allison, that there is some point where, an EV might not make sense for a use case, super cold climates, kind of long distances. So it probably doesn't go to 100%. There should be exceptions. Canada has set more aggressive targets. As you mentioned, what I had saw was 50% by 2030 and 100 by 2035. So if they pulled that forward, that's great news.
Mm-hmm.
The only note there is so much of this is kind of a ratcheting mechanism with the infrastructure. So are the charging networks in place? Are the homes kind of equipped for at-home charging? As you kind of grow the new car sale rate, you kind of have to invest and build the broader ecosystem. And as I'll talk about in a second, the repair side of this is going to be something that has to be expanded from a capacity perspective.
Mm-hmm.
All of these are faster than the United States trends. If you look at even some of the most aggressive forecasts in the United States, we're thinking that we would reach about a 10% total car park by 2030.
Gotcha. Yeah. I'd have to say I agree more, maybe not the same. Clearly, you're saying Canada has a faster adoption here. I can see us being around maybe the 15% mark, but I don't see us getting 100% of the car market being at the head level, or at least new vehicle sales. And it seems that our viewers agree with us here. About 92% of people said that they do not see the Canadian government reaching its goal of zero emissions vehicles by 2030. So yes.
That would be the most aggressive global target too, I think. So yeah, 2030 is coming up.
It's way sooner than we think. It's about 8 years now if we basically consider 2022. So yeah, moving on. We could talk about hours about this, but the repair segment is really why a lot of our viewers are here. So let's dive into that.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that's just setting the context, but EV repair is just different. As we talked about, the cars themselves are different. Tesla operates their own collision centers and also approves their external repair partners. That's also slightly constraining overall capacity. EV repairs themselves are just more costly. They're more complex. Technicians need special training. Battery replacement has, kind of, again, even a further differentiated skill set that's required. The battery themselves are actually quite complex to disassemble. They're very integrated into the structure of the vehicle. So much about the EV itself is coupled with technology. So ADAS is, full sensor suites, and what we're seeing as part of that is, across all vehicles, if you look one generation over the next, you're seeing about a $1,000 increase to just replace those front end parts. And CCC has done some great work here talking about how much scans are required, how much calibration is required. And again, that just constrains technician time and increases overall cost. The last point there is OEM parts. So getting access to OEM parts where almost all of the production is being allocated towards new. They're not holding back, or at least my understanding is they're not holding back a lot of kind of raw material or kind of supply components for that repair network. So that's lengthening out repair cycle times as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, like we said, the whole presentation we've been saying, multifaceted. I mean, ADAS is already a big question mark in just regular non-EVs. So adding that into a mix of a vehicle that you don't fully understand, it's a dangerous situation if you don't exactly know what you're doing.
Yeah, so just, kind of 2 pages here at the end to kind of show what we're seeing. And we have a very wide variety of damage profiles for EVs. On the left, it's looking at a 2020 Model 3, side impact, probably high velocity or high delta V, estimated cost to repair $23,000. On the right, that's a 2020-21. It's quite a low impact rear end collision. Estimated cost to repair are only $4,400. But we're seeing these cars come into our ecosystem for a number of reasons. One being just lack of available repair capacity, really high returns, or kind of pushing some of these vehicles into that kind of total loss threshold.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of think about this from 2 different buyers. The buyer of the vehicle on the left is thinking about what parts can I salvage off of this vehicle? What else can I kind of reuse it for? On the right, that car's probably going to go back on the road. So that's more of the rebuilder type of buyer. And then, kind of just our buyers are looking for these cars. It's absolutely kind of a constrained environment. 30% of our EV sales are going to international buyers. That probably skews more towards that car on the right with, lower damage, more expectations of that car returning to the road. In the United States, there's also a nuance where a salvage titled vehicle for a Tesla cannot access their supercharger network, so that car becomes a little less valuable. The buyers, when you look at like a buyer of an EV versus a comparable vehicle, we have 40% more bidders participating in our auctions. The average selling prices are 65% higher, and that's 15% higher gross returns as a percentage of what the retail price of that car is. And inside of that environment, we're looking to do a number of things. One, it's really to try to lead on differentiated handling and storage procedures. One, for the safety of our kind of team members. 2, it's how do you kind of build a preservation capability? So, for example, charging. And how do you store these cars during the cycle time that we're trying to sell them, and make sure that battery is kind of maintaining its characteristics and its performance attributes. And then 3rd, and we've talked to so many buyers about this, but what is the health of the battery? That is a bit of an unknown in our buyer market. And we're looking for partners and in-house innovation to try to identify how to diagnose the health of the battery and provide that kind of context to the buyer base to create kind of even more transparency.
Mm-hmm. Sort of curiosity, maybe you don't have this exact date in your head, but when did you guys start seeing a increase in the EV demand versus your comparable vehicles? Is this recent, or has this been kind of on track growing for a number of years?
Yeah, I think the Teslas have always had high demand. I haven't looked at it going back more than just the year-to-date stats here, but if you look at just the average selling price, they were always kind of reaching really high levels.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay, interesting. So we're almost at the end of the presentation here, folks. Have your questions locked and loaded. We will have a Q&A period following the session for David if you have any questions about any of the content we've discussed here. But
yeah, so just recap, what the governments do and what the different agencies do will impact both consumer demand and how EVs are handled. As we talked about those first responders, we are expecting some kind of government involvement there. The real high kind of costs, labor shortages, constraint on aftermarket parts, we think will really drive or create a bit of a tailwind for these kind of repairability decisions and push total loss frequency. Certainly we're trying to partner and identify buyers who have a very kind of narrow EV focus. Right now, that's not the case. The buyers who are buying EVs also buy a lot of other vehicles. And then safety is, what we're, internally, hyper focused on, for our team members. We've just launched, I think a week ago, some new safety protocols where we're trying to kind of create new training modules around how to work through, for example, the Tesla computer screens and provide a little bit more data from that computer environment for our buyer network. But yeah, I think safety is is paramount.
Absolutely. I think it's the baseline we need to start, because if you don't have a grip on what the safety is when working with electric vehicles, you're putting yourself in a seriously risky situation. And we saw that from the pictures in the earlier slides. It's a scary fire. So yeah, thank you so much, David, for all of your insight here today. Well, I've got a couple of questions just off the top of my head before we've got some more come. I'm sure we'll have some more come in. So feel free to ask your questions. But I'm just curious, obviously we know there's the right to repair movement going on right now. You're saying EVs will cost more to repair. Do you foresee, I mean, maybe impact, this is beyond your perspective, but do you foresee maybe some more customers trying to repair these vehicles themselves as opposed to taking them to the service centers? Do you think the OEs are doing a good enough job of making customers understand how difficult these are?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an area that we're certainly monitoring. I think there's some legislation or suits working their way through in Massachusetts, the United States, for example. I don't have a good sense of that, and I haven't really followed it, to the depth that I feel comfortable kind of talking about it.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
I think, there's going to be some movement there, and right now, for example, a lot of these EVs have a lot of proprietary kind of data feeds and data streams, and in other industries, those have opened up eventually.
Yeah, I was just interested to hear your
thoughts. It's a great question, and it's something that everyone's kind of tracking.
So we kind of talked about it a little bit, but obviously insurers are going to be in for a lot more write-offs and whatnot whenever the electric shift comes in. There's a lot of models obviously coming through the pipeline right now. Do you foresee any that maybe would overtake any of the vehicles we looked at today? There was obviously the Teslas are always high up on there. Rivian is pulling up quickly in the US market. What are your insights for for models incoming and how they might perform?
Yeah, I think we do expect the market to slightly flatten. There's going to be, tremendous investment, and the new vehicles that are coming on board are, kind of really, I think, a little bit more competitive than what's in the market today. So yeah, I think the forecasts now seem a little bit more likely than maybe they were in 2019 and 2020.
Gotcha. Okay, we've got a question here from Ken Sherwood. He asks, have you ever heard of any special requirements from insurance providers for collision shops to have charging capabilities? With the long delays in parts deliveries for EV vehicles, a vehicle could be in the collision shop for months, possibly leading to dead batteries. So have you heard anything about insurance providers potentially offering something that would not let that happen?
I haven't, but no, I mean, that's kind of the point we talked about in terms of what we're looking at is how do you optimize the health of the battery during the time period between sale. If a EV battery goes to zero or a zero charge state, that could diminish its total capacity. So, that's something we're looking at. Obviously, a repair shop would be kind of concerned about the same state. What we've seen is if you put the car in the standby mode, that greatly lessens its day-to-day discharge rate. So you can really, get much less than like 1% per day discharge. So the battery is, even 50% charge, that would give you 50 days. But yeah, if it's 90 days, if it's 3 months due to part shortages, yeah, you probably want to have to top that car off at some point.
Gotcha. So you'd want to have charge. I mean, there will be a day where eventually all repair shops, at least I predict, will have a charging station on site. When that day is a big question mark on the calendar, but great. Another question here from Rob Bentley. As to reignition, is there a time frame where risk gets less, or is it an issue or at any point after the collision? So if the collision happened 2 hours ago, is there a lesser risk that a fire is going to break out, or is it more?
I believe there is a curve on it where there's a higher degree of reignition after the fire has been put out, and that's just due to the retained heat inside of the battery. But the NTSB report in January, I think, identified that any vehicle that has previously been on fire is at risk if there is still stranded energy in that battery pack.
So if a vehicle is not disengaged properly, then there's a risk of it being parked in the lot and it not spontaneously combusting, but bursting into flames in the parking garage.
Yeah.
Scary stuff, guys. So I mean, obviously that's a big one. We've got still waiting for more questions in the queue here. Let's see if I've got any more on my sheet here. We talked a little bit on our dry run here about UK EV adoption, how it's a little bit more ahead than North America. Could you give some insight as to why you think that might be?
Why the European markets are a little further ahead?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's probably a function of this, like the organic costs for the, kind of like gasoline and the taxes. So they have a bit more consumer incentive to convert, and especially in France, where they have like high nuclear power as their kind of source energy. They probably have even kind of lower costs to operate an EV versus a comparable car.
Mm-hmm. So I just know there's some confusion with people wondering why the Europeans are so far ahead. Okay, it looks like we don't have any more questions in our queue here. But if anyone has any questions that come up after the session, you can either reach out to myself or to David, and we will be more than happy to answer those questions for you. But I just want to say thank you to everyone so much for joining. Thank you so much to David for that thoughtful insight and all of the data. And again, from joining us from Chicago, always nice to have some US friends on. And again, thank you to Blair as well for being on the call here, and Impact for sharing all the data with us.
Yeah, team, thanks for having us. Very exciting times, and this is kind of the next wave in the automotive industry for sure.
For sure. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has a great Thursday and has a happy weekend. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.